Super. Thank you very much, Lucy. So I wanted to start with a bit of a confession, actually. I'm embarrassed to admit that when I was first awarded my Nuffield, I was fully intending on spending the next 12 minutes boring you all about software and data. As Lucy said, we just started Soil Benchmark. In fact, we literally launched the platform the same week I got my tie in Exeter. Quite what I was thinking, taking on a Nuffield as well, I have no idea. But I drunk the Kool-Aid. I was convinced that software and data were going to be the things that would get farms to change how they were managing their soils. And I was completely wrong. It became clear pretty quickly, both from my travels and from building the business, that while software can definitely help with compliance and make it quick and easy to do that, it's not the thing that gets farms to change how they manage their soils or any other practice for that matter. And even now, with a million hectares using the platform and AI getting cleverer and cleverer, I haven't changed that opinion. And so my Nuffield became much more about people than software. And I really wanted to explore what actually gets those farmers to change. I drove more than 6,500 miles through South America, across Australia, and up through Europe to try and find out. And so my plan now is to bore you about that instead. A key moment for me came just before I set off on my first solo trip up through Europe. I was traveling in this white van, taking a 5-foot taxidermy salmon up through to Norway, but that's another story. And before I got started, I was chatting with a guy called Nick Mariner, who's a cluster group facilitator in the Chilterns, and he said something that really kind of impacted the rest of my travels. I'd kind of been thinking, oh, well, it's all about getting farms more knowledge and information, and then they'll be able to make these changes. And he said, you're kind of jumping ahead. The first thing is you've got to get them to care. Why do they actually want to make a change? Then you can give them the advice and support and stuff. And actually, even after that, you need to get them the funding and support they need to actually then implement that change. So these 3 steps: motivate, advise, and fund. And of those, across all my travels, motivation was by far the most important in getting farmers to want to change. If you could get them to want to make a change, they'll often work out the other steps. And across my travels, I found these 6 key motivators. I don't have time to go into all of them. You have to read my report for that. So I'll just touch on a couple. First one is community. So across Oz, when I was traveling there, people would say, if you're really interested in this topic, the 2 industries that have really got this cracked are cotton and then feedlots. And so speaking to growers like these 2 Andrews in those industries, came that there was a couple of common themes. The first is both those industries have had a lot of external criticism, and that's created a kind of us against the world mentality that's really got them sharing ideas and innovating. It definitely helps that they're both made up of a relatively small number of quite large growers, but that's created this kind of almost like family atmosphere in the industry. I mean, sometimes literally the annual cotton conference on the Gold Coast is literally a family event. Farmers bring spouses and children. There's a creche on site, loads of social activities alongside the seminars. So Joe, maybe some ideas for us in Leeds next year. But I guess in the UK, maybe the most similar industry might be Harry's old industry, growing veg on peat in the fens. And actually, they're doing similar things now, coming together through groups like Fenland Soils to work together more. So the next one I'll just touch on in terms of motivators, if the slide will move, is the Grazing for Profit course. So it's a brilliant scheme in Australia run by the inspirational Terry McCosker, and it's impacted more than 10% of Australian farmland. It's a 6-day kind of residential course for farms to go on. Again, it's a kind of family event. People usually take spouses with them on the course. And when I met Terry in Brisbane and asked him about it, he said the reason it's had such an impact on grazing management all across Australia is that they don't actually really start by talking about grazing at all. They start by talking about what people want to get out of their farm, values, succession, all those really thorny issues. And then grazing comes in on day kind of 3 or 4, just as a kind of consequence of all of that. And AHDB actually already brings the US version of this called Ranching for Profit over to the UK. It's actually happening this week. But it's only once a year. And so how can we get more UK farms through transformative courses like this? Maybe it needs someone in the UK to pick it up, adapt it to the UK and run with it. Maybe someone in this room. So once a farm is motivated and they really want to make a change, say to their soil management, then the next step is getting them that practical, trusted guidance to help make a change. And the closest thing that I found across my travels to a silver bullet for this was well-facilitated farmer groups. Now, obviously, there's a lot of those already in the UK. I'm sure many of you are part of one, maybe a discussion group. But I wanted to see how they work in other countries, particularly Argentina, Denmark, and Australia again. This is an ERFA group in Denmark, for instance. again, loads of different examples in my report, so I'll just touch on 3. The first one is Argentina. This was actually a bit of an accidental Nuffield trip. I was on my honeymoon in Patagonia, staying on this estancia, and I got talking to the gaucho, you can see here, Gus. And it turned out he previously had been an agronomist, and so much to my wife's disgust, I ended up talking to him for hours about soils and farming, and my Nuffield came up, and he said, "You've got to meet my friend Maria. She works for CREA." I'd never heard of CREA at the time, but I'm so glad he put me in touch, because it's a really amazing organization. They run farmer groups all across Argentina, and there are a couple of things that stood out for me. Firstly, they've got this quite unusual structure of how they run the meetings. So each group only has 12 members. They meet once a month on a different person's farm, so everyone hosts once a year. And the host starts out by setting out kind of some problems they're facing, a couple of things they want help with. They then leave the room, everyone discusses it. And then the host has to come back and sit in silence and just take the pretty brutal feedback from their peers often. The second thing is that all the groups are linked together. So the facilitators, lead farmers in each province will come together and share ideas, and then someone from each province, they meet up nationally. And so ideas spread across Argentina like wildfire through this network. Things like no-till 20 years ago was spread by this network. It also helps support the facilitators. They kind of learn from each other. And it actually acts a bit like the Nuffield network, in that a CREA farmer from Patagonia can go and meet one, stay with one. In any other area of Argentina, they really welcome each other. So maybe a great network for Nuffield International to tap into in Argentina. A common theme I found across all these countries was that the best groups have really good facilitators. They've got to be punchy, able to herd cats, and crucially, be able to kind of spend enough time actually devoted to the group. And a key part of that is having stable funding to allow them to do so. I really like the way that Australia had kind of cracked this. So a big part of their levy money, as well as a lot of their R&D budget, goes directly to farmer groups. And so a lot of the big groups are now turning over kind of millions of dollars a year. They have a CEO rather than a facilitator. And people like Birchip Cropping Group or Riv Plains having a massive impact on farming practices, changing those in their regions. I'm sure the Aussies in the room can attest. And the lovely thing about that model is it's kind of 2 birds with 1 stone, because as well as funding all the knowledge exchange work that a good group does, it also means that their research is really farmer-led, and they get much higher rates of adoption of new ideas than we do here. And then the third one I'll touch on is AMP. So I was put onto this by Dave Brownhill, who you can see in the top left, who I met out in the CSC in Brazil. And he was one of the original 23 farmers who set up AMPs, which is a kind of 2-part. They have a normal kind of grower group, but then they also have a commercial arm. So it's an input supply because sell feed and fert and stuff. But all the members of the farmer group commit to put at least half their input spend through the commercial wing. And so that now turns over like 100 million Aussie dollars a year. And the profits from that go back and fund the research groups. They've had more than $10 million have gone into that. It's a really simple but self-reinforcing model that would be great to see over here as well. So once a farm really wants to make a change and then they know what they want to do, then the third aspect is funding to help them actually get that off the ground. And so everywhere I went, I looked into both the public and the private schemes that were available to support that. Supply chain schemes were really interesting. The key kind of take-home message was that they need to put their money where their mouth is if they want to have an impact. I was really impressed in Denmark by Arla's Farmer Head scheme, which puts a premium on the milk price to support certain actions you get points for. But kind of by contrast, in Australia, in the bottom right here, I've been really excited to meet the Cool Soil Initiative. They had loads of industry backers, seemed to be doing great stuff. Actually, when I kind of dug into it, they weren't really having much impact because there was no money attached, and so farms just weren't actually making changes off the back of it. The other big source of private funding that I saw working all across Europe as well as here was from water companies. That was really making a difference. But again, by contrast, things like carbon and nature markets that I was expecting to be a big part of this story, everywhere I went was a bit of a disappointment. They were always just another couple of years away from taking off, and no money was actually really flowing. Another one that I wasn't expecting to look into was the role of landlords in supporting change on tenanted land. Again, this came about through another kind of classic Nuffield moment. So I'd met Martin Davis at the CSC in Brazil. He's the CEO of Nuveen. It's a big global farmland investor. And then I bumped into him again on a flight completely randomly from Sydney to Perth when I was in Australia. And he very kindly put me in touch with one of their tenants in Western Australia, Ty Fullwood. And you can see on Ty's farm here, they're doing soil amelioration work, they call it. They're kind of delving up the clay subsoil to increase the water holding capacity of their beach sands. And the problem is this kind of soil amelioration work is really slow and expensive. And so tenants like Ty prioritize it on their own land rather than on the tenanted land. It's obviously a problem for Nuveen. And so the way they're solving it, they've developed in their Polish operations, actually. Martin put me in touch with James Little, who runs those. a kind of almost like an SFI scheme, an agri-environment scheme, but the rewards for farms for doing actions like planting cover crops aren't direct payments. They get things like longer leases or reduced rent increases, things like that. And EFBTs in the UK, I guess, are doing a similar thing, people like the National Trust and Crown Estate. But actually, overall, when I kind of stood back, all of these private schemes were still just dwarfed in scale and impact by public funding, particularly in Europe. And I was expecting to travel across and find examples in true Nuffield style from abroad. And the more I traveled, the more I came to think that actually SFI is a really world-leading scheme. The farms I was talking to about their schemes mostly just wanted to ask me questions about it because they were really impressed by the flexibility, the ability to stack funding. And so, yeah, I guess the main message to DEFRA will be don't change it too much, just reopen the thing. And for other governments in other parts of the UK to learn from the successes of SFI. So just to kind of recap then, for farms to change, I think there's those 3 key steps. Motivation is by far the most important, and there were those 6 key motivators. Then advice and trusted guidance is crucial, and well-facilitated farmer groups were the closest thing to a silver bullet for that. And then finally on funding, public funding is still the main game in town, and SFI should be tweaked rather than radically altered. So how's that changed me and Soil Benchmark and what we're doing? There's a couple of things I'll touch on here. So one of those motivators that I saw, particularly in Australia, was the role of benchmarking groups in really keeping farmers kind of competitive, wanting to improve. And we're working on a new part of the software to help make that really easy for consultants to run benchmarking groups, which we're excited about. And then the other one is, in terms of farmer groups, I've talked about a lot, and I've been working with Lucy and others actually to try and build more of a network like I saw in other countries. We ran an event at Allerton a week ago linking 50 facilitators, and we're going to grow from that, hopefully. So that just leaves me to say some thank yous to my wonderful wife, Cressida, who's been a real rock through this all. We got married during the middle of my scholarship. To everyone I stayed with, made some real lifelong friends. To the Yorkshire Agricultural Society for their very generous sponsorship. And finally to Nuffield itself for this extraordinary experience. Thank you.